often talk about the role of organisational and cultural aspects, we focus more on what we can do ourselves to sort of take control and navigate the complex academic lives that we have, but also, you know, especially being female in that context. So a bit of a different session today, and I'll just show you, I'll talk through what we're going to do, but just to remind you, please also remember to mute your microphones, but we do love to see your face, and it's wonderful to see so many already. If you have any problems, message the support team in the chat function. And as I always say for these talks, try to just dedicate this time to yourself by just, you know, sitting back and relaxing and listening and reflecting a little bit rather than, you know, trying to do your emails and stuff at the same time. I'm really grateful today to acknowledge that we are on the land of the Whadjuk people from the Noongar Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Feel free to share on chat which land you are on today. So what we'll do is I will do my usual thing, which is to talk a little bit about some of the research on this topic of what it is that workplaces can do to help and support women academics and researchers. And then we're really excited today to introduce to you an ARC Laureate Fellow, Peter Taylor, who's going to share a really powerful and important intervention that he and his colleagues led, which will really bring to life, I think, some of these ideas. You're welcome to submit questions through Slido or through the chat, and Lucinda will pick up on some of those a bit later on. I do want to just remind you, if you joined us last time, it was actually quite a long time ago now. It was in June. We did a webinar on making a difference. If you didn't see that, we had some really great insights from ARC Centre Director, Professor Janine Baxter, who's really coming at this from a more social science perspective. And we also had some wonderful insights from Clitty Grease, who actually is coming from a more science perspective. And if you recall, she had these amazing videos and pictures that she uses to communicate the importance of her work. Okay, so why should we even be thinking about organisational strategies for academic women? Well, as those of you who regularly attend this session know, academic women have very different career experiences and outcomes compared to academic men. And we all know that we live that, but I'll show you a little bit more data on that in a minute. The second reason is, why do we have these different experiences? Well, of course, it's not women's fault. There are systemic and cultural drivers of these different experiences. So it's really important to look at what organisations do, because it's not just up to individual women to lean in. And you know, it's really important to look at that bigger picture. So what are the different work and career experiences that women have? Well, you just have to go back to some of our previous webinars. For example, we've had a webinar on homework challenges, and for example, lots of research evidence that women experience higher homework conflict because often they are doing more of the care or domestic duties. Whether that's right or not, it's not the issue. The fact is that is what happens. We had an assertiveness webinar where we talked about how there are different social expectations for men and women, or we can call them stereotypes, which we discussed a lot in that seminar, how it makes it very hard for women to be both warm and competent. So you remember we talked about how some of the stereotypes are that you know, women should be warm and fuzzy, and therefore it's very challenging for women to be seen as both warm and competent. And similarly, stereotypes restrict women from getting into leadership roles, into STEM professions, etc. In the network webinar, we talked about how academic women typically have less access to networks, and especially those at networks of power. And we talked in the Glass Cliff webinar about how female leaders can experience this phenomenon called the glass cliff for all sorts of reasons. So I just wanted to remind you that when we talk about why we need these practices in organisations, we've covered a lot of this material in the webinar so far. But let's look at some hard data. This is the ARC's this is all ARC data. This is the research workforce in 2018. I'm sorry I didn't update it, but I have to say it hasn't changed much. So, you know, you could expect the same picture about now. And what you can see is that if you look at women, which are the black bar here, you can see that women and men are about the same number at level A and B, but you can see the gap widens such that at level E, of course, there are fewer women. Let's have a look now. This is actually more recent. This is the DECRA Awards in 2022. And I just, so if we look here at what you can see is that 413 DECRA recipients were female, 574 were male. So still quite a big gap at the DECRA. You can see the success rate was about the same. So when men and women applicants try, their success rate's about the same, but ultimately fewer women are putting their hat in the ring. And that's not necessarily women's fault, just to be clear. So let's look at Laureate. We actually see an even bigger gap emerging. So we actually see here there's a higher success rate for women. So in 2021, it was about 20% of females who went for a laureate got one, compared to 7% for men. But what you see with these numbers down the bottom here is that men, which are in the blue, are getting the laureates much, you know, because there are more of them applying, more of them are getting them. So those are just outcomes you're all familiar with, I know, but just to remind you that we have different experiences compared to men, and we have different outcomes, and that's why it's really important that we look at what drives those different experiences. And of course, there are these systemic, organisational and socio-cultural drivers of these different experiences. And so that a lot of people talk about this idea of second generation bias now, and the idea is that the sort of first generation bias is most people are familiar with, and that's sort of outright bias and discrimination, you know, hostility to women and things like that that are clear and obvious and everyone understands. Second generation bias is more subtle. It's more about some of the things we've talked about, actually, these sort of stereotypes and beliefs about gender that get in the way of men and women being treated equally. And also the fact that many of our work practices, our organisational practices, inadvertently, they don't deliberately, but they inadvertently favour men because they've been set up by men, you know, with sort of male working models in mind, and so on. So what this all means is that no matter how much us individual women lean in or engage in positive strategies, challenges will remain for many women. So I'm not saying that this means we're all victims and we should sit around doing nothing. That is absolutely not what I'm saying. I actually think we should engage in positive strategies because we know that's actually going to help, and lots of research evidence shows that's the case. But it's not the only thing. We also need to be looking at what it is our workplaces are doing. So what I want to talk about now in the next 10 or 15 minutes are some examples of things that workplaces are doing in this space. And we refer to them as interventions because they are efforts to change the current status quo. So this paper by Doherty and Manfredi in 2010 talks about different levels of intervention. Now, I have to say I don't quite agree with the way they've structured them, but I think it's a useful framework. So the first level is adopt good human resource practices. So what this means is that workplaces, when you're selecting people, when you're promoting people, which are two critical points where disparities can occur, you know, you should have clear selection criteria. You should have gender balanced panels. You should be monitoring the outcome of selection processes so that you can see if there might be bias occurring. And you should have training for managers and people involved in selection so that they can sort of be aware of practices that might inadvertently lead to bias. These sort of ones tend to get done in organisations. I mean, most of us in universities would have these sorts of things. Because they're sort of pretty, well, I was going to say easy. They're not easy, but they're, you know, they're pretty straightforward to sort of implement these types of things. Of course, another thing we can do is recognise that women have, as I've said already, you know, more work-home conflict. They have, you know, they are the ones that give birth to babies. So how do we support women as parents and as careers? So, of course, these are all, again, the obvious things around maternity leave, but not just maternity leave, but paternity leave and parental leave, career breaks. How do we support people when they come back after career breaks? Sort of what childcare opportunities are there? Is it subsidised? Do people have flexibility in their work? Because, of course, that enables people to manage those demands, those homework demands, more effectively. And then we can even go further and say, should we, you know, we need to think about what time meetings are and, you know, make sure that they're not at school pickup time, etc., etc. So lots of interventions that we can do to support parents and carers. But here we get to level 3, and I think this is why it's sort of a higher level in these guys' model. You know, we can start to say, what about that more indirect discrimination, that more subtle stuff that happens? So here we need to be more nuanced and make sure that our selection criteria are not just transparent, for example, but make sure that there's no indirect unfairness. And I guess things like ROPE in the ARC system, where we ask for opportunities, is an example of trying to say, you know, we need to recognise that people have had different opportunities and let's include that in the process. We need to apply that to other forms of selection, not just research grants. Educating managers to help them understand that men and women have sometimes had different opportunities for all sorts of reasons, and you know that they need to take that into account in these processes that shape people's careers. We can go up another level as well and say, actually, we need to do more than all that, and we need to actually engage in positive action. But this is positive action aimed at women. So this is more saying women have got these gender differences in careers, and let's support them through specific networking opportunities or professional development opportunities or leadership development opportunities and so on. And then level 5 is validate and promote an enabling leadership style. Actually, I'd honestly put that at number 1. To me, that's foundational. But, you know, I think, again, what that is signifying is that a lot of the ways in which women get disadvantaged happen irrespective of policy. They happen because leaders, their bosses, their immediate supervisors are behaving in ways that are you know, indirectly or directly biased. So leadership of managers, supervisors, etc., is crucial. So let me just give some examples of these sorts of interventions. So, and some of these are from the US, and that's because I'm trying to always use published examples, and I couldn't find so many Australian published examples. But if you know of any, or you know of any cool initiatives that are happening in Australia, please pop them in the chat so that others can share. But here's an example. So this is an example of a human resource intervention. So to change the way that we recruit in order to improve the selection. So this was in a STEM context at Montana State University. So first they did implicit bias training. So that is really training to help the search committee understand that even though you might not be intentionally biased, you might have, and all humans do, frankly, in order to make sense of a complex world, we simplify things and we stereotype, but that's a human process. So, all of us have some sort of implicit biases, but being aware of them is really important. And so this initiative involved training about implicit bias. It gave guidance to the committee about trying to recruit diverse candidates. They had an initiative where they connected the candidate to a family advocate to discuss work-life balance. So someone in the department was identified as someone that the candidates could talk to about work-life balance. And they found that committees that had this intervention, search committees that had this intervention, offered more tenure-track faculty positions in STEM to women applicants than search committees that did not receive the intervention. So if we do these things, they can actually work and make a difference. Other things you can do, diversity statements in the application. We again see that quite often. Active search for women applicants. So not just put the ad out there and hope that women will see it, but actively target women applicants through this network, for example, would be a good example. Another idea I really liked was specifically identifying talented female PhD students and inviting them to visit the department, because then, of course, you build that relationship and it's going to increase the chance that they might want to work there and also that you might want them to. Training, all sorts of training can be done. The more that training's experiential, the better. I can explain what that means if anyone's interested later. And women-only appointments, and we're going to come to that later with Peter's presentation. So there's the recruitment and selection process, some examples of things that we could do. What about mentoring and networking? As we know from the webinar that we did, mentoring is really important for women. But not necessarily are all women getting the same opportunities. So example of a formal mentoring intervention where you set up a mentor and a mentee. This paper showed that reduced the gender wage gap. Another study showed that having a formal mentoring intervention created higher readiness for leadership of the mentees, which is great because that's what you want, and other positive outcomes. So some of this research shows that it's not, when you have these mentoring relationships, it's not just that you get more resources and advice and contacts and encouragement, but you also get feedback to reduce performance worries, which is important because, we did a session on the imposter syndrome and how often women are experiencing that worry and sense of imposter. So, having a mentor who can provide mentoring can reduce that sort of worry. It's also important from a signalling perspective. And what that means is that mentees benefit almost indirectly of the status of their mentor because it signals to people that that mentor values them and thinks that they're worth mentoring. So there's also an important signalling function of these interventions. And at this point, I just wanted to remind you of the importance when we did our session on mentoring and sponsorship, that mentoring, that we talked about the importance of sponsorship of women, which is, it's called allying in some literatures. And that's that idea that it's not just about, giving advice and support to women, but it's also about actively sponsoring them. So, putting their name forward for, exciting projects, or inviting them to be on grants, or whatever the relevant thing is that would help their career. So that's the mentoring and networking. Again, we can do things that actually work. Here's another example. This is one done by the University of Michigan. And this is one where when people start in a new workplace, there are 5 senior people who've been nominated as, the mentors for those new people. which I like that idea actually, because it's not just, it means that they've got the new people have got, and these are new women, obviously, because this was a mentoring intervention for women. It means they've got more than one person they can go to, depending on what their, their needs might be. Another one, I like this. This is another one I like. Florida University faculty recruited STEM professors specifically for their mentoring of women and underrepresented groups. So that was part of the selection criteria. You're more likely to get this job if you are someone who mentors women and other underrepresented groups. And then, of course, there are various networking initiatives like the network we have. But another example is one that has a newsletter that advertises women's achievements. And that's nice because it speaks to, what I mentioned just a second ago about imposter syndrome and things like that, where people worry that they don't, have what it takes. If you can see other women like you doing those things, it can help. There is some evidence that if you train people around biases, that it reduces biases. So, and this would be an example of trying to tackle some of that indirect discrimination. There is, I just wanted to talk about leadership development for women academics, because that was one of the questions that I asked you to reflect on. And if anyone has joined late, go to slido.com and there's a question there. And the question was how comfortable you would feel doing a leadership development program just for women. So first of all, there's some research that shows that people find it useful and beneficial, and I'm sure there's more research than just this study that I'm showing you. But for anyone who's designing these sorts of programs, I strongly recommend this article that I've put here by Eli and Hermina Ibarra and other people. What they do in this paper is talk about how these sorts of women-only leadership programs can be really successful, but they need to help women navigate the biases. And so they need to talk about second-generation biases and structural issues and the sort of stuff we always talk about in the Women in Research series, to avoid a sort of, we don't want to do women-only leadership development that sort of positions women as victims who are passive, but equally doesn't position women as the cause, and that all they need to do is change themselves. So effective women in leadership, women programs that develop female leaders recognise and discuss and think about the context that they need to navigate. Positive action, and I'm getting close to wrapping up here and passing you to Peter. Positive action means, sometimes you have to go further than all the things that we've talked about before. And Lisa Cooley, some of you may know, runs or used to run, it's closing soon, Centre of Excellence in Astronomy. I've forgotten its exact title, but she has done some fantastic work to improve the number of women in astronomy. And you can look at this paper yourself if you're interested. She talks about all the forces that have meant that women are just seriously underrepresented in astronomy and don't get promoted as much and so on. So even things like speaker invitations. So she, I think it's Lisa, has this initiative around all of the conferences they do. They always have female speakers. Even things like allocation of telescope time, there's evidence that women don't get as much time, etc. So Lisa says in this article here that if we just keep going as we're going, the fraction of women at all levels, not even just the high levels, will be below 30% for at least 60 years. So in the light of this, the argument that just continuing to do what we're already doing doesn't really fly. We have to do something different. And we have Lisa talking about this on our Women in Research website if you're interested. So she and others now in other places in Australia have been hiring only women in these higher level positions. And there's a nice article here for anyone who wants to explore that more. And you're going to hear from Peter, who's going to talk more about this as well. There are token woman concerns that pop up, and Peter will talk more about them. So this feeling that, this actually might not be good for the women themselves. But some of Lisa's solutions that she talks about in this article are, if you make those women-only positions really prestigious, that can really help with that. So longer term or with a higher salary or named, so that it doesn't just feel like women only got it because they are women. Another strategy she talks about is the value of advertising for multiple women at once. So I just want to quickly go through some challenges of these sorts of interventions, because what I'm basically saying is we can do things and they work, but you do need to invest. They're not free. If you're going to have mentors, for example, if mentors are not actually trained and committed, it can actually do more harm than good. So, investment is required. We have to watch out that these initiatives don't become an added burden for women. Putting more on their plate and increasing burnout and so on. We have to recognise that sometimes people feel a sort of sense of stigma for needing a mentor or for participating in a women-only leadership program. And often fear backlash, especially in these positive action programs. It can actually, in some circumstances, perpetuate occupational segregation. So, for example, Cardador talks about how, in the context of engineering, promoting women engineers to management actually can reinforce the stereotype that women are not as technical as men. So it's not that we shouldn't be promoting women to management, women engineers to management. We just need to be understanding some of the things that can be occurring as a consequence. Demand and supply needed. That means we need to create, we need to, advertise for women, etc. But we also need to make sure that there are women there to apply. So we need to be building those pipelines as well. We need to be involving men, and that's why it's so wonderful that Peter is here today. And that's partly because men tend to be, as we know, in the more powerful positions in organisations. But sometimes men can be unsupportive or hostile about these policies. There's some research that shows that men are more supportive when they have ownership over the program. So involving men and having them drive and lead these initiatives could be a powerful way forward. It can really help if men have got a senior man in their world who is actively supporting women. So that senior male role model is important. And another thing that research shows works is if men are reminded of their values, because most of us as human beings want to be fair and we want to be supportive and all those sorts of things. So being reminded of those values can also help. I'm going to skip over this. This is really just saying it's really important, because that's a lot of words. Sorry about that. It's really important to evaluate what we do. Whatever we do, evaluate it to see what impact it has. And that's really, really important. This, for example, is an evaluation of Athena Swan in the UK, which shows partial effectiveness. So some things worked, some things didn't. And it's really important we understand that so that, we can change these programs, tweak them, not abandon them, but change them, develop them, grow them, or introduce new programs to pick up the bits that are not being effective. So I hope that was helpful, guys. I wanted to just give a bigger picture overview, share some of the research, and what we're going to do now is delve a little more deeply into one example intervention. So I'm absolutely delighted today to introduce ARC Laureate Fellow Peter Taylor from the University of Melbourne. He is a mathematician and he is the director of ARC's Centre of Excellence in Maths. You can see there all of his research interests. He's not going to be talking to us about his research today, but he's going to be talking to us about a very important and significant initiative that he has been involved in. So I am going to stop sharing and I am going to pass you to Peter. So yes, let me just see if that is working. So Peter, are you there and able to share your slides?
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right, I'll try and share my slides.
Fantastic. So ready to roll whenever you are, Peter. Yes, wonderful.
Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can. Great.
Okay. So first, I'd just like to acknowledge the fact that I'm sitting at the University of Melbourne on the land of the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And the second thing that I'd like to do is just say how thrilled I am to be invited by Sharon, Isabel and Lucinda to talk to you today. I met Sharon when I was actually invited to talk to the named laureates, which are the Georgina Sweet and Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Fellows of the ARC. And I regard that as one of the greatest honours I've had. There were a couple of other men there, but I was an absolute thrill, and I won't forget that day and meeting so many really highly talented and high-achieving women, of which Sharon was one. So it was a very thrilling day. And when Sharon asked me to come and talk to you guys today, I certainly said yes straight away, and I was very much looking forward to it. So what I actually want to talk about is the experience of my school, the School of Mathematics and Statistics at the University of Melbourne, when we decided to appoint, to advertise some female-only continuing positions in math and stats, and this happened back in 2016. So I'm just going to go through what the experience was of the school, and I guess even there I'm actually giving my view of it, and you might find other people in the school that think differently. But anyway, that's all I can reasonably do. But before I start about that, I just want to say a little bit about who I am. So I'm a professor. My actual title is Professor of Operations Research, which is the mathematics of decision making, optimization and stochastic modeling, which is what I do. It's modeling random processes. And I have to say my academic expertise does inform my view of this, because I think the whole point of recruitment is about decision making under and you know, I guess that's the way I look at things. I have been an ARC Laureate Professor. Unfortunately, that finished. It's one of the best things that can happen to you, but like everything else, it does come to an end. And I also have been a director of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Mathematical and Statistical Frontiers, which actually also finished at the end of last year, although we've got a lot of wind-up activities still ongoing. I'm an editor-in-chief for 2 international journals, so I do get to look at a lot of papers and things that get submitted and make decisions about, you know, if papers get accepted or not as well. One thing that I think is really important is to say something about where I stand, because I'm conscious, I don't know if there are other men listening today, but I know I'm in very much the minority, which I guess is an experience a lot of you guys will have had anyway in academia. I don't have any standing to talk for female mathematical scientists, which is who I'm going to talk about. I don't have the lived experience, and so I have to listen. But as Sharon was saying, I do think it's important for men to be part of the effort. And what I hope my role can be is to use my experience to speak with female academic staff to make it easy for them to participate in my discipline. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm certainly not trying to speak for anyone who's a female mathematical scientist. And I'll acknowledge those 2 points. A bit of a paraphrase of something that Kucha Edwards said about the singer-songwriter Paul Kelly when he discusses Indigenous issues. Paul Kelly is not Indigenous, but he's well known for speaking with Indigenous people, and but he always makes very clear that he's not speaking for them. So, back in 2016, the School of Maths and Stats, the University of Melbourne, advertised 3 female-only continuing positions. They were tenable at either levels B, C or D, and the intention was one of them would be in pure maths, one in applied maths and one in statistics, which are the 3 major fields of endeavour that we've got in the school. It actually generated a great deal of interest in the media, and I've got a website there. When it happened, our head of school, Alex Ovcharek, was actually basically on the media, radio and TV for a day and a half. So there was a lot of interest, and there's just one that the ABC have a webpage where they mentioned it. Previous to that, within the school, there had been a committee. We were very aware that in our school we didn't have proper gender representation. And so there was a committee that decided to propose various solutions, and we went through a lot of the normal ones that Sharon's already talked about. And in the end, we decided to recommend. The committee actually was chaired by Kerry Landman, and it had Aurora DeLagalon, two of the female professors we did actually have in the department, as well as Peter Forrester and myself. And we recommended that we should do this. But I have to give Alex, the head of school, credit, because it was him who pushed it very hard, along with Janine Healy, who was from HR at the time, and they made it happen. And it was Alex who has talked to the media a lot about this. So a lot of people questioned was it legal to do this and why? I don't like this slide because it's too long. I tell my students, don't try and put too many things on a slide, but I think you have to put all of this in one place. So I'll leave you guys to read it. Essentially, the intention was that we want to increase the diversity of our workforce in the school. And there is a measure that you can use in the Victorian Equal Opportunity Act, which basically says that if you've got an if one or other gender is underrepresented in a particular employment category, you can specifically advertise for the other gender. So we use that, and I believe that's not true in every state of Australia, that there's such a measure in the Equal Opportunity Act, but there is in Victoria. So just before I go on, if anyone's got a question that they want to ask about that, maybe I'll just give an opportunity if anyone wants to ask anything about this. Okay, well, if anyone does want to ask, then maybe they come back to it later on. So back then, there was a thing called the ANZStat mailing list, which is a mailing list that statisticians, so this isn't the whole clientele of our school, we're a mathematics and statistics school, but this was just statisticians, and statisticians, unlike mathematicians, can be split from across the university sector, but also industrial sector, and some of the people on the ANZStat mailing list are in corporations and government entities and things like that. But anyway, when this happened, there was a debate broke out on this mailing list. And I've copied some comments down here. There were a lot of them. That's why it's got ... at the beginning. But I picked a few, and someone said how Orwellian that the Equal Opportunity Act is decided to support inequity and discrimination. And the misspelling was the person who originally, this is word for word, cut and paste, so inequity was misspelt in the original comment. Someone else said, as a female, I'd personally feel uncomfortable for applying for a position that was for female applicants only. I'd be worried that if I did land the job, my colleagues would look down on me as only having got the job because no males were allowed to apply. Someone said, I could not agree more. As a female myself, I find it best bizarre and at worst insulting. So it's a sort of stronger version of the previous comment. Someone else said they are making a genuine and well-intentioned attempt to address a problem. I suggest we leave them to get on with it and see if it works. And as you see, there were a lot of other comments, but there's a spectrum. There's a definite spectrum from people that were insulted by the measure right through to some people who are supportive. So I never did say very much on this mailing list, but I decided to actually say something when this broke out. And so this is what I actually wrote. That as a staff member and an ex-head of the school, I'm going to prepared to speak up in support of it. What I said is, for a whole range of reasons, the school is not as effective as it would be if it had a better gender balance across its academic staff. The usual first measures, such as requiring gender balance on appointment committees and trying to get gender balance on shortlists, haven't worked. But the school is serious and which has led to the advertised positions. And for me, we did actually have a position in my area, stochastic processes. We advertised, we had an international field of applicants. We got down to a shortlist of 5, and there were 3 women and 2 men on that shortlist, and one of the men we deemed as not appointable. The 3 women we all deemed to be appointable, and one of the other men, and the position went to the man. Now, I can't argue with that. He's very, very good, and he's subsequently proved to be a really good member of the school, so that's fine. But the 3 women were very, very good too. They've all had different careers, and one of them actually did get here and is here, and I think we're very lucky to have her. So we did have gender balance on the appointments committee. We had gender balance on the shortlist, but we didn't appoint a woman. And I think there's a problem with that. So I wrote that. There was again a reaction, and there was a few people who weren't willing to actually say things on the full mailing list, and they started out sending me emails directly. And so there was a side conversation that started. And this is from a male who said, "Every woman I've mentioned has found the ad surprising, insulting and offensive. They seem to perceive there's an implicit assumption that women cannot compete on a level playing field with men for these positions." The person gave us the credit that we didn't deliberately do that, but it sure seems to be perception of many women. It's concerning, isn't it? And another person in this side conversation said, "My own personal opinion is that academic recruitment should be gender blind, which is certainly how every hire that I've been on committee for has been done." So this person's from America, I think, because that's an American way of saying things. "For well on 15 years of my career now, dozens of hires at 3 different unis, and by doing so, the issue will sort itself out soon enough, especially with the steady increase in proportion of female graduates and research high degree students. I do not believe there's gender discrimination in hiring in academia anymore, at least against females anyway." I've been on lots of committees. I don't think I would be prepared to say that. I'm not sure. I'd like to think that I'm not discriminating when I'm on a panel, but I wouldn't be so confident to say that I'm not, even personally. And to say it about a whole committee, I think is rather weird. But anyway, there were 2 other comments I got. This is what I said in response to those. And I think there's some important points here. Even in this debate that was going on this mailing list, there were women both for and against the University of Melbourne's initiative. There were men both for and against too, but I'm not really so interested in what the men were saying, but I am interested in what the women were saying, because I think that's important. And it's certainly true that there was a spectrum across that, even from the women who were posting. But there is one thing I want to say. This whole world of level playing field, we should just say right up that that's a fantasy that doesn't exist. I don't think anyone, we have the idea, okay, someone puts in an application and we look at, they've got so many publications in good journals, they've got good teaching and evaluations, all that sort of stuff. And we line one up against the other, and then we sort of say, okay, this person's got more papers, so they're the person we give the job to. I think that's really silly. I mean, that's really looking at past performance, and really we're not interested in that. We're actually interested in future performance, and we're also, more than that, interested in how the person's going to perform in the environment of, say, the school that the position is in. So it's, of course, true that past performance is an indicator of future performance, but it's not a perfect indicator. And everyone will have had their good and bad experience, and will have had to fight in different ways to develop that paper record, and that's sort of formalised in the idea of rote. But I think we should just forget that it isn't just a matter of looking at 2 people's records and trying to say that one's better than the other and pointing that person. If you do that in appointments, I think you've got it wrong. So I get really annoyed when people say we should appoint based upon a level playing field, or you've heard the Liberal Party saying we pre-select based on merit. Well, that's a fantasy. That should always be challenged. And this is where my background in probability comes in. I don't think you should treat it as if those things are absolute truths, because they're not, right? These things are always judgment calls, and you make the judgment calls to try and, any panel should be making them in good faith and ethically, but, they're entitled to use judgment. And the other thing I pointed out was that I didn't say anything about being fair or not fair to any applicants. I really didn't. And I think it's only when you put that away that, for me, it becomes clear what you should do. Because what I said, it was framed in terms of what was good for the School of Mathematics and Statistics, that we needed to have an effective workforce, and any workforce in any place is better if it's got diversity. That's, I think, something we should all be saying. And we recognised that we weren't as good a workplace, and we weren't doing a job as a School of Maths and Stats as well as we could have if we had more women in the school. So we didn't say we want to be fair or not to people applying. We just said we want to be a better place. And I think that's something that's quite important. But of course, we do have to acknowledge that when you appoint people, there are things that might be said about them. I mean, it is definitely a risk that appointees might have to deal with a negative perception. They got the job only because no males are allowed to apply. I can't say that doesn't exist. I think it does. I don't think it's all that big, and I will say what subsequently happened. But what I would say, even if it does exist, we've got to change the situation. We've got to move the environment. And it's unfortunately true that you can't do that perfectly. You can't get to a situation where this isn't an issue, which is what my goal is. I want my daughter, who's 17, I mean, she's not going to be a mathematician, but some of her friends are very good and might be. They shouldn't have to deal with this stuff. So the goal we should all bear in mind is to think about the legacy we leave in the future, where hopefully we won't have these problems, or if we do have them, we don't have them to such an extent as we do now. So I do think it might be, it might be true. It's the same way that if we require more women, female representation on appointments committee, usually that ends up with female academics having higher administrative things. Most measures have a cost, and to try and say you have to do something, and just because something has a cost, I don't think is a reason not to do it. But one comment I will make, and this is probably true of me, so it's a fair, no one thinks negatively of bright young men who've been nurtured all their lives, praised, looked after, and mentored ever since they were little boys. No one sort of says, oh, well, you only got it because you had all that. Somehow that's all gets bundled up as being part of the level playing field. And I think we have to change the debate about that. Now, of course, affirmative action is what I'm talking about here in the gender case, but affirmative action happens in lots of other situations. So it's not like we can't learn from experience in other areas. And I'm a big sports fan, and in particular, I'm a big fan of cricket. And the South African cricket team has what they call a transformation policy. They actually have quotas for what they call, and it's complicated in South Africa, people of colour, but also Black Africans. There's two separate quotas for those two things. And way back in 2015, one of these, what you might call as a transformation selection, scored the first century by a Black African batsman against England. And Firdaus Munda, who is a female cricket commentator, a woman of colour as well, who I think is South Africa's best cricket writer, had something to say about this, which I've written at the bottom, that he is a transformation selection, but that's the point of the policy, to find Black African players who are good enough and give them opportunities. That person, Themba Bavuma, is now the captain of the South African white ball teams. He is, obviously that was a success. And I think that is a really, really good way to think about all this. Transformation, it's about changing the environment. So as soon as you stop thinking about whether it's fair or not fair to individuals who apply for jobs who don't either get them or don't get them, I think it's pretty clear. It should be about changing the environment. The final thing I've got to say, we advertised these 3 female-only positions in 2016, but we actually did start a gender strategy a bit earlier. So since 2015, we've made female appointments across all levels and for a number of reasons. Our overall number of female continuing staff in the school has tripled from 9 in 2014 to 28. Now, I can't actually in all honesty, put all that down to this initiative. We've got things like some of our casual staff becoming continuing because of recent industrial reforms. We've had a policy for trying to recruit, so trying to solve the two-body problem. Sometimes partners of both ways around, either a female partner of a man or a male partner of a woman have been recruited. So we've had these type of things. But the fact is, we've now got 28 female continuing staff in the school when we only had 9. And I should also mention that we have been lucky enough to be growing a little bit. But that's a lot better than it was. It's nowhere near 50%, and we've still got work to do, but it's better than it was. I'd say that the female-only positions have 2 major effects. One is the external perception that our school cares about this stuff. And I think much more importantly, there's an internal culture shift. We're very happy with the appointments we've made. And I don't think, apart from a few people who were involved in the actual appointments, I don't think most people in the school know who got those female-only positions. We've just got a quota of women working in the school, and no one asks the question of how they got there anymore. So Sharon and Lucinda and Isabel, that's all I've got to say for the moment.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'm sure everyone else found that as fascinating as I did. And, thank you for your courage, actually, in endorsing it right in that early stage when it would have been easier to keep quiet, because we need these sorts of initiatives. And look at all those wonderful hands clapping. Let's go to Lucinda. Lucinda, if you can just stop sharing your slide, if you don't mind, Peter.
Yeah,
and Lucinda is our wonderful PhD student who's going to share the Slido and hopefully squeeze in a couple of questions.
Yeah, I'm going to really rush through the Slido because we've only got about 6 minutes to go. Can you see that on screen?
Yep, great.
So we've got, I would be uncomfortable engaging in a women-only leadership development program, and about 80% disagreed with that, which is great. But I think what's interesting, this seems to be the most spread out kind of results that I've seen in any of the women in research responses. So I think it shows how complex these experiences are. And then we had having women only appointments can be an effective strategy for shifting the gender balance. And we had, oh my goodness, I can't do maths, 75% agreeing with that, which is great.
And potentially, Lucinda, maybe Peter's presentation today will, even influence some of those attitudes.
Yeah, I always wish we can do a follow-up Slido after the presentations. I'm going to unshare my screen now and do maybe 1 or 2 of the questions. I can figure out how to do that. I think something that was interesting in the chats, which I was trying to keep track of as we talked, was the difference between, we've got kind of the culture that needs to be changed within departments so that we've got the acceptance of these women-only roles, as well as the women's attitudes towards it. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about what women might be able to do to help change their attitudes towards it. Because if you've got all these imposter syndrome kind of issues compounding the idea that you're kind of a token hire, is there anything that women might be able to do to help themselves feel more confident in applying for these kind of positions or engaging in affirmative action?
Peter, you go for it.
This is a difficult one because it's really getting close to me speaking for women, and I'm not sure that I quite know to do that. But one thing I would say is that I think it helps when you get the support of other women. So I really hope that the women that are there would support all their colleagues. And I think we have a women's walking group that's about 1 kilometre around the University of Melbourne, and I believe, I don't know, I've never been there, but they, women at all levels, professional staff and PhD students and senior academics as well, go for a walk and discuss things and, you know, mentor each other. And I can remember when I was a young PhD student, I used to go running at lunchtime, and one of the runners was Ren Potts, you know, the senior professor in the place. It makes a big difference if you get to know senior people on a personal level. So that type of thing, I think, works really well.
And if I can just add to that one, Lucinda, a couple of things, because it's such an important issue, you know, and those comments you shared, Peter, were really interesting. First of all, I think if women understand why it's not a level playing field, they can look at it a bit more systemically rather than individually. And that's to your point, Peter, it's not a level playing field for all sorts of reasons, but sometimes when you're caught up in a system, you don't see that. So understanding is really important. I'd say look at the research for, you know, as women, you know, let's adopt an evidence-based approach to this. All of the evidence shows that these strategies are one of the most powerful ways to change things. And, you know, we might not like them, but that they are what works. And the third thing I would say for women worried about this is all of that fuss about, oh, you only got it just because you're a woman, blah, blah, blah. It fades, it dissipates. And you gave that example beautifully, Peter. But I've seen it in my career, you know, that there's a lot of hoo-ha at the time, but it goes, people forget. And meantime, you've got more women in the department, you know, who are doing great things. So those would be my 3 tips for that one.
Another question for Peter that we got on Slido. Have you conducted interviews or focus groups with the women who were hired? Did they feel that they had to work extra hard to prove themselves once they were hired?
The answer is no, we haven't done focus groups. In fact, there were 3 women hired. Only 2 of them are actually in the department. One person left. She works at another school in Australia. The 2 that were hired, as I say, most people don't know who they are. They're both colleagues and co-authors of mine. I can't speak for them, but I have talked to them personally about these issues. As I said, I can't speak for them. One who I do know quite well does not want to be a poster person for women. She just wants to do her job. So she's happy to have the job. I don't think she would even be comfortable talking in this forum about it. Yeah. And the other one, I haven't talked in as much detail. So, you know, I doubt they would even be responsive to being in a focus group about it.
Yeah. But that speaks to the point of, you know, you get on with it, you do it, and things are, you know, things usually work out okay. And I love this comment from Ravani, if I can just share that, Lucinda. How people perceive the reasons that you were hired for are far beyond your control, and they are a result of their bias, not necessarily fact. As a woman of colour, I've had people assume that I was hired via affirmative action. This is how they process my success and possibly their own experience. So I love that comment, Ravani. Thank you for sharing. Lucinda, I think we're probably out of time.
I think so too.
But look, I would just love to say this has been a great discussion. We will have more on this topic if people would like. So let us know if you've liked today's topic. And just last but not least, thank you so much, Peter, for joining us. It was absolutely wonderful to hear your experiences and have you share, you know, that change is possible. And I love that message. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. It was an absolute pleasure to be here.
Great. And you'll see, Peter, there's lots of very positive comments on the chat. So, yeah, thank you, guys. I'm afraid I have to zip across to this other talk that I hadn't prepared for. So I'm going to have to jump straight off. But thanks, Isabel, Lucinda, as well. And thank you again, Peter. I'll email you a bit later.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.